So this is part 2 of being a teleological minister. And I have some wise colleagues who are sharing some of the insights that came from some breakout groups. Bernard, talk about acting as a threshold, particularly in the sacraments. Bernard, do you want to say anything about what you mean by that?
I think lots of people live out Christian lives as disciples, and for many people that's kind of lived out in the raising of families, the working hard, being active in their local communities, being charitable and kind and loving and so on. And lots of us in church communities provide loving service. But as I think you may have caught at the tail end, when we've got a decent community centre at my local church, and one of the things that come up sometimes, it can be conversations around it can be a bit transactional. And one of the things I always come back to is, anybody can run community centres. Local authorities probably do it best. We're doing something different. We're trying to bring God into the mix when we do stuff. And so there's a threshold that ministers can be at, which is in that loving service, being part of what's going on, being a presence, available sometimes for pastoral care, those side conversations when parents bring toddlers to a group, when they come to a fire pit, all kinds of little things. And then there's a more deliberative form of ministry when you gather for a particular Christian purpose, a service or a memorial, or for something that's fundamentally religious. And then there's the sacramental purpose, which is to stand at that threshold with all of the community and to feel and be inhabited by the presence of God.
I think that's
all of those areas are very similar, because we don't do it on our own.
Absolutely. And I quoted Bursma talking about small s sacraments, that actually there are many aspects of the natural world and of human behavior that can be a small s sacrament if we look at them with the right eyes. And that's what we're trying to do for people. And that fits very much with Naomi's comment. You will never look into the eyes of someone God does not love. So it's not just that you and I have a destiny, a telos, an end, that we are being called to see God face to face. It is that all of God's people that we interact with, even those that we find most annoying, also have a destiny. And I think that's so, that's so humbling. And one day we will look back at our present interactions, and I don't mean that in a scary way of one day you'll pay for all the mistakes you make. No, not at all. One day we will appreciate the full depths of that pastoral conversation that we had, that we thought at the time, oh, this is completely useless, that nothing's going to happen that's any good as a result of me having this conversation with that person. But still we were helping them towards what God is calling them to, which is to see God face to face and enjoy him forever. And one day they'll look back, beyond death, on the new heaven and the new earth. I imagine, who knows how this will work, but I imagine that they will look back on that and see how God was at work in that conversation, being a sign, says Judith, pointing to something bigger. And again, that's where the idea of a small s sacrament is really helpful, I think, enabling people to catch sights of God's cloak and wanting to follow it, helping people to come into ever deeper relationship with God. Do you want to explain God's cloak?
So we were talking about the risk for teenagers to look at confirmation as a box that you tick. Now I can stop going to church, possibly. Box I can tick, I get out of here. And it's, as teleological ministers, we are developing and offering opportunities for them to see confirmation as a key that opens the next door in the corridor, or opens the next room along the corridor, and they go into that. And what they're doing is, as they go into that room, we're offering opportunities, supporting them, encouraging them, praying with them and for them, so that they keep catching sight of God's cloak going through the next doorway, and they want to follow that into the next, whatever it is. And it's just this sense that God is always ahead of us, always calling us forward. And as we go through each of those rooms, we are being shaped more and more into the living stone that will fit just that gap in the wall of living stones that is our destiny.
I love that. I love that. And that brings in that corporate nature. So if we see this as I, as an individual, have a destiny to see Jesus, you know, him, me, just the two of us, then we're missing something. And talking about those living stones in the wall, as you just did, Judith, really helps us to get away from that. And I love the idea of God's cloak. So it reminds me of something that Gregory of Nyssa said, that he talked about Moses saying to God, I want to see your face. And God says, you can't see my face. All you can do is see my back. And then immediately Gregory goes on to say, and that's true with Jesus as well. What do we see? Well, at the moment, we follow him. What do you see of somebody you're following? You see their back. You see their cloak. One day he will turn, and we will see him face to face. Meanwhile, we will follow him, but we'll see something about what he does and the way he walks that will make a difference and make us ready to see him when he turns. And it is the seeing him face to face that will transform us. And Nikki, you talk about pointing towards a higher purpose. I love that bit, sort of being a signpost. Is that the metaphor that you're working with? Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. So let me explain where this comes from for me personally. In July of last year, I stopped being head of training for the Diocese of Chelmsford and became instead lead advisor for formation and well-being. So well-being, I had some sense of what that means, but what does formation mean? Especially because I was very aware that someone else, Tim Goodbody, had the responsibility for the vocations team. So whatever formation means, it can't mean doing his job and that of his team. And because I was very aware that Jane was about to take on what had been my role in the training of ministers and including curates. So whatever formation means, it couldn't mean interfering with what Jane was doing with her life. So what did it mean? So I asked Rob Merchant, who's my line manager, what does formation mean? And he said, what if you saw vocation? What if you saw formation as eschatological? Wow. Okay. So I started to think, what would it mean to see formation as rooted in the future? Because I was noticing how often our conversations about vocation are rooted in the past, in the doctrine of creation. finding my calling often comes to mean finding what shape I am. And I mean, that's absolutely right. Back in the 1990s, I worked in a theological college in Hungary, and there we created something we called SHAPE, which has now become the SHAPE course. It's used in lots of churches. It was lovely actually to come back to the UK and then to the Diocese of Chelmsford, and the SHAPE course, which I'd lost contact with for nearly 20 years, suddenly people were talking about it again, and we now have the copyright on it. So I'm now responsible for using those particular materials and helping other dioceses get hold of them as well. But so that's absolutely right. Some of what vocation means is about finding what shape I've already been made. And yet, formation, what if we understood formation teleologically? What if it was also about what we are called to that we are not yet? What if that could bring something that's enlivening and surprising to the conversation? In other words, although God calls us to be what we are, and he absolutely calls us to be who we already are, what if, surprise, God also calls us to be something that we aren't yet? So I think a future view helps us with vocation. And so when we're talking about people who are wondering what God's calling them to do, I don't think we should be content just to say, okay, so what shape has God made you up till now? I think we do need to ask that, but I think we also need to ask, have you got any hints of the future, any trajectories, any longings? Because maybe God's going to do something that will blow your socks off. So that's something about vocation, and then our conversations about ministerial training. You know all about ministerial training because you are recipients of it as curates. These conversations are often exclusively connected to the present. And if we're not careful, it all becomes about how can you be useful as a minister? As if ministry, not God, was the ultimate thing. And the more ministerial training is about present usefulness, the more difficult trainees find it to stand firm for convictions that aren't in line with the programmatic goals of your church or your deanery or your area or your diocese or the Church of England or whatever. When I first became an incumbent, which was in 2005, I think I was at the very collaborative end of my peers. At that point, there was something called the Chelmsford Leadership Program, and it was something for new incumbents, and most of my peers were taking quite a hard stand. I'm not saying they were trying to be heroic leaders, but they were definitely saying, I'm going to be the boss in this church, and I'll act kindly, but the buck stops with me, so I'm going to make the decisions. And I was the one being very consensus and wanting to ask questions and work, make sure that everyone was on board. Now, as I talk to people who are becoming incumbents today, or perhaps have been incumbents for a while, I find myself on the other end of the continuum. I'm the heroic leadership one. Well, no, I'm not. I'm not quite. But I'm the one that's saying no, but you need to take a principled stand sometimes. You need to say no. Actually, sometimes the role of an incumbent is to say to a PCC, I'm really sorry, but we're not going to do that because there are ethical reasons that is wrong, and I'm not going along with it. And I'm not saying what that, you know, obviously each of us will put those lines in different places, but really important that we get this thing of both being able to take a principled stand and keeping emotional connection with everyone around us, so that we are always aware that we might be wrong. And it seems to me knowing you have a destiny helps. Knowing that you are being called to something which will end with you seeing Jesus face to face, that actually helps you to take a stand now. It helps you to put up with a certain amount as well. If you knew that tomorrow evening you were going to have a 9-course Michelin 3-star meal in a restaurant you have dreamed of all your life, then you could make do if you have a lettuce sandwich for lunch. It really won't matter. If you and I know and are constantly reminding ourselves of how brilliant the new heaven and new earth is going to be, how great the heavenly banquet will be, how excited we are that one day we will see Jesus face to face and be transformed by that, well, it might help us to put up with stuff that isn't ideal for us at the moment. And anyway, ministry is joyless when we forget that we are all pilgrims on a road towards joy. So the antidote to being useful, because you are not meant to be useful. My sisters, brothers, and siblings, you are not supposed to be useful. God is not useful. God is useless, by which I mean that God is not to be used. He is beyond all of that, and so are you. You're to be a servant, but you're not to be merely used by those around you. So the antidote to that sort of present-oriented, useful ministry is formation that surprises us with tomorrow's freshness and helps us distinguish what is ultimate from what is not. To ministerial training belongs process, and the process really matters. I mean, you know, you're still going to have to fill in Appendix 2 from time to time and work out if you've met the framework of qualities. I mean, that's part of it. But formation, that's beyond that. That's about end. God is not useful, and ministers are not supposed to be useful either. Or no, it's not merely useful. You and I were made to see God face to face. How? Well, through scripture, through human goodness, through the natural world at the moment, and then in a new heaven and new earth, fully. And that desire to see God face to face, that's what we're longing for when something groans within us. And we will allow the Spirit to draw us through the things of creation into contemplation. So Sarah Coakley, who I've been talking about, she defines contemplation as, quote, prayer or communing with God that does not use ordinary propositional language, but rests in silence or near silence, being willing to be there with God without filling the space with all our good and highest thoughts. End of quote. I think that's quite good. Sarah Coakley isn't easy to read, I will warn you, but if you ever have a chance to hear her speak, I think you will find her inspiring. So I talked about scripture and human goodness and the natural world. And of course, there's the church. So I'm going to read you a paragraph from Bursma about the church. And depending on your present experience of the church, this may or may not, at least the final sentence of this paragraph, may or may not make you snort through your nose at how great an understatement he is making. And I think he probably knows he is making. Here's what he says. See if you can spot the understatement when he makes it. Quote, throughout Christian history, great saints have attested to this reality. Church is a unique glimpse of heaven. Now, of course, harps and clouds are no more literal than talking about heavenly beer or parties. Language about heaven is always God accommodating God's self to us. Beauty itself, God in Christ, is the true and final reality. He alone satisfies the aching longing that throughout our lives we have felt. On Sunday mornings, we get a taste of this final glory, which is the worship of God. This requires imagination. End of quote. Yeah, tell us about it, Hans Bursma. But the imagination required is worth the effort. I mean, I don't know if you find sometimes that you're in a church setting, perhaps where you're leading the worship, frankly, and you're like, what am I doing here? And actually, it's easy to see it as a bit irrelevant. If I wasn't doing this thing of worship, actually, I could be of some use. You know, I could be volunteering at the food bank if I wasn't, you know, leading the Wednesday morning Eucharist or whatever it is. And Bursma says, no, but this stuff, it's a foretaste of the new heaven and the new earth. This is what you were called for. You know, now he's exactly the person who said, and human goodness, not least at the food bank, is sacramental with a small s. He's absolutely not saying don't bother with the food bank, but he's saying when you're in worship, let your imagination draw you forward, because this is your future, beyond time, beyond the appearing of Jesus. So, scripture, human goodness, the natural world, church, and ministerial development reviews and spiritual direction and celebration and brokenness and dreams. All these and 100 other means will lead me to contemplate and see God. And seeing God, well, of course, we cannot see God in this present world, but we can somehow sense, perceive, experience God. And then my contemplation, just me being me, in the presence of God being God, will teach me how to spot God in all things. Gregory of Nyssa talked about our heart being enlarged through contemplation until it can encompass the whole created world. And Augustine talked about our mind being stretched like the mouth of a bag that you have to keep pulling and pulling and pulling at until it becomes big enough to encompass the wonders of God. And my world will be re-enchanted, so that it won't just be a physical world, although it's really important it is physical, and it being physical is an entirely good thing. But the physical world will be imbued with transcendence as a place where God can be glimpsed. And all my fellow pilgrims, well, they also exist, teleologically speaking, in order to see God. I will appreciate them even if the world doesn't. And you'll have heard this from C.S. Lewis, I suspect, and it comes very close to what Naomi, Judith, and others were saying, I think, earlier. Here's how C.S. Lewis puts it: the dullest person that you talk to today may one day be so transformed by the beatific vision that if you saw them now as they will be, you would be strongly tempted to worship them. There are no ordinary people. He puts ordinary in italics. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, they're mortal. Cultures, they're mortal. Art, that's mortal. Civilization, that's mortal. And its life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, someone on their way to the beatific vision is the holiest object presented to your senses. End of C.S. Lewis. So, appropriately awed by encountering these persons, including the ones that annoy me, I will engage in action with them, not for them or without them, but with them, for justice and mercy. And this will be increasingly relational action in an increasingly relational church, because I was made for a face-to-face encounter. So being relational must be important to the person that God is making me even now. Okay, so one last strand, and then I'll shut up and ask for your feedback on all of this. And I should say I've delivered the first draft of a Grove booklet about this to a publisher. So that's why I've been doing this thinking. One final strand of thought about the beatific vision. St. Peter Damian tells us that the beatific vision, or having in our mind the beatific vision, is the way to make sure that we do not love the world. And that sounds like that's saying the exact opposite of what we've said so far about small s sacrament and things. But Peter Damian puts it like this: if it is visible now, it is to be scorned. I mean, today we don't talk like Peter Damian, and thank goodness for that. But there is a verse in 1 John that says, "Do not love the world, nor anything in the world." Somehow we have to both love the world, the natural world, human beings who live in it, our fellow pilgrims, and not love the world system, the way that people are oppressed and abused, and the way that injustice has its dominant part in many areas of the world system. We might want to talk about differentiation. That is the ability to remain connected with others, loving human beings, and yet stay distinct and not have our reactions and behavior determined by the systems of which we're a part. A differentiated person is a non-anxious presence when other people get anxious. A differentiated person does not do for others what they could do for themselves. And maybe our ministerial training programs, by being embedded in what is not ultimate, don't always help ministers differentiate in anxious systems. And I'll let you into a secret. The Church of England is a very anxious system at the moment. What if we said, I am not going to love these systems in the denomination or the parish that I'm part of? I will love the people and stay connected to them, but I'm not going to love these systems. I will not love the world or anything that is in the world, even as I love all the people who live in it. If you say to yourself, I exist in order to see God in Christ in unmediated, endless joy, I do not expect this world to satisfy me. I will love God, appreciate people, and have my heart constantly enlarged. Well, paradoxically, an unsatisfied desire for the beatific vision, coupled with the secure knowledge that you exist for it, can help you live cheerfully as a contemplative, differentiated, justice-loving, relational child of God. Quite enough for me. I'm going to shut up for 10 minutes, and that will give you an opportunity to say if there are any thoughts that have been triggered in you about your destiny, the destiny of those that you work with, and that thing of not loving what is not ultimate. Judith.
So the thought that's triggered in me is, if we're going to, so we love the immortal, but not the mortal. People are immortal. Creation is immortal because there will be a new heaven and a new earth.
Mm-hmm.
But nations are not, social structures are not, economic systems are not, politics and political parties are not. So that means, as a teleological, eschatological minister, I am always looking for the immortal strand in any situation. Right. So yeah. I'm looking for the immortal strand and attaching myself and my efforts and my love and my energy to the immortal strands, not the mortal ones.
I think that's what C.S. Lewis is saying, certainly. And yeah, I think that might be quite helpful, because the systems are really good at getting us to do what the systems want. And that may or may not be the right thing, but it's difficult for us to take a principled stand when that isn't the right thing. Well, how do others feel about that? Yeah, Bernard.
I think I've always had a strong sense of the transitory nature of this world, because otherwise, how could you contemplate the message of Jesus, which is that there will be an end of time and a huge translation for those who are judged for it into something ineffable and wonderful and all-encompassing, and the deepest of joys and glorification of us in God. So the transitory nature of this world has never been something that's troubled me, including my own time in it, for now, which is even more transitory, because unlike the huge tree that you were talking about earlier that's been prepared for a mast, you know, we don't live that long as trees in this world. But I think there's a kind of it's different from worldliness, it seems to me, which is a kind of an enjoyment and an ordinary level of the things of this world. And I think all of us do enjoy that worldliness to a greater or lesser extent, taking a beautiful walk in the countryside, sitting quietly with a pet or a friend in silence and sharing the comfort that silence can bring. And I think because I've been volunteering at a hospital for in recent months, there's a kind of a very much a transitory thing going on there, to which one must quickly become accustomed in order to provide effective ministry in a hospital context, because people come in and people go out, and their relatives and friends with them. The staff stay, but even the staff change. But I do think there's a kind of in a modern Western context more so, I think, but not solely in a modern Western context, which focuses on individualism, and some denominational Christianity focuses very much on individualism in a way that troubles me a little sometimes. But there's a kind of the worship of the family and the things that promote the family's well-being at the cost of almost anything else is something that you encounter in every direction that you look, in a way, including in the church family. And I think there's a kind of that's a different, I think that's more in line with the becoming besotted and overcome, not by materiality, but to substitute the worship of God and the love for God for the deepest kind of love for something else, which is not worthy of the equivalent love that you ought to have for God. But we do give it an equivalence that we're kind of accustomed to doing. It's almost in the DNA.
I think that's really profound. And I hear exactly that you're wrestling with this thing of like we don't want to, we want to be worldly and yet not worldly. We want it to be all about community, and yet sometimes it can be quite negative if everything is all about, you know, there are togetherness forces that can be quite negative. So when he's talking about the new heaven and the new earth, again, back to C.S. Lewis, he has a really interesting set of thoughts where he thinks, well, it can't just be that we like dissolve into God as if God were one liquid and we were another liquid. No, because we will always be children of God, even in the new heaven and the new earth. We will always be us. Union with Christ cannot mean ceasing to have a personality of our own. And yet, it equally, it can't be that we'll just spend all of our time looking at each other and building a community with each other in the new heaven and the new earth, because I mean it's really clear that Jesus is going to be central and we're going to be gazing on him. So how do you get both of those things, both an appropriate sort of individuality and a sense of community, without losing the centrality of Jesus? And I think the answer he comes up with is really interesting. I mean, it's entirely speculative. Who knows? But this helps me to start to think about how we should behave now. So here's what he says. So in heaven, I like the language of new heaven and new earth, but C.S. Lewis likes the language of heaven, and who am I to tell C.S. Lewis what language he should use? In heaven, he says, each soul will perceive and know and forever praise some one aspect of the divine beauty that they will see better than any other can. Why else were we created but that God, who loves each infinitely and has given us all different eyes, can love each differently? So we will spend eternity seeing God, gazing upon him, and telling one another what we see, because even in eternity, each of us will see something that our fellows do not. And our gazing and telling each other will be something whereof earthly art and philosophy are but clumsy imitations. You see, I think that's beautiful. I have no idea if that's really what's going to happen in the new heaven and the new earth, but I think it's a beautiful picture. And if that's where we're headed, then that helps me say, okay, so that does give value to art and thinking and conversations about God and so on now, because now for sure, I'm going to see something of God that you don't see, and you're going to see something of God that I don't see. And the magic is in us sharing it with each other and listening really well to each other. And yeah, and maybe, and so on and so on and so on for all eternity.
Am I allowed to say I can't wait?
I think that's right. Yes, that's the right response. But you'll have to. And the waiting is about growing your desire, making your heart bigger, your mind bigger, to encompass all of this more and more. Naomi.
So what struck me is what you said about formation being eschatological. I think, when you've gone through this process of answering in many different ways, how is God calling you? How are you being formed? How are you being shaped? And yes, don't get me wrong, I totally agree that's important, but I'm getting to a point where I'm just like, I'm not quite so interested in that. I'm like, can we dare to believe in what's, this divine purposes and this bigger purpose? And actually that's where our formation is. Like, I think that's really profound. Kind of particularly where we're at in terms of ministry. Yeah. I just thought it was a really good way of putting it. And I think you're right. I liked what you said about the present usefulness. And again, don't worry, everyone, this is not a critique of the systems that are in place. We need to have these things in place. But I just thought actually that's just brilliant. That sense of destiny.
Yeah. So one of the people who had talked,
beginning to make me think.
Yeah. One of the people who's talked most fully and interestingly about the beatific vision was St. Thomas Aquinas. So the word that gets used is Thomist, Thomist. A Thomist is somebody who values Thomas, but in this case, Thomas Aquinas is the Thomas we're talking about, who was a Dominican friar in a couple of generations after Dominic and Francis of Assisi, when all of this was being systematized a bit more. And he uses a term called eutrapelia, but you don't need to worry about what it's called. And that means it can be translated as godly playfulness or gracious good humor. And he says somebody who is a eutrapelos, somebody who is godly, who is playful in a godly way, they're neither a buffoon without moral seriousness, nor are they a humorless person who treats their present situation as if it were of ultimate significance. And he's getting at exactly this balance that several of us have been talking about, I think. So he's saying, look, it's possible to live in a world in a way that's just buffoon-like. The Boris Johnson, no, that would be unfair. But it is possible just to be a buffoon and not to have a sense that there is anything beyond what we can see and hear and touch. Well, that can't be right. But it's also possible to be so serious that we treat the present struggle for justice, for example, or whatever it is, that as not only important, it is really, really important, but also as of ultimate value. And Aquinas says, no, you have to avoid both of those things. That your interactions with the world are really important. Martin Luther said, if I knew Jesus was returning tomorrow, I'd plant a tree today. You know, it is really important. The ecological crisis is real. The struggle for justice is non-negotiable. We need to do it, absolutely. And yet, even these really important things are not ultimate. And if you know that you are on the way to the beatific vision, then you can treat these things with appropriate moral seriousness, but also a nice kind of godly playfulness. And I think he was onto something. I don't know how you do it, but I think he was onto something. Bernard.
It isn't one of the things that he's saying that we should always look at what we're doing, the things that we're obviously, whether we take them serious, we take them seriously, but also joyfully, and with a wondering, if we don't see it directly, where it fits in the beatific journey. And I think there's something playful about that. Even a kind of a, you know, you have a session with multi-sports with 3 9-year-olds and you find yourself standing there with a smile on your face as they tell you the story you told them last week back, and you didn't think that they'd remember it, and fall out with each other. And you do wonder, I know I'm on a godly journey here, but I wonder where it fits into the whole godly journey for all of us and for everywhere. It's a kind of, and I do find that an acceptably playful way to look at the world, and it kind of gives us a prod, you know. Take your pious po-facedness and put it where it belongs.
Exactly. I mean, or another way to look at it is, when I look back on this moment from a perspective of 400,000 years in the future, when I have been for presumably almost 400,000 years in the presence of Jesus, how will it look to me? You know, how will today look to me in that perspective? I mean, the thing that I am really chuffed about that I achieved today might look a bit less splendid, but my failure will look like a lot less of a tragedy. Thank you all very much. I'm going to stop recording.